that any different than an idol worshiper jumping around in front of the fire? It looks a little different. It looks a little more elegant, but it's still basically to craft for myself an identity. Do I want productivity? What do I do? Do I prostitute myself to work? Give over my resources in an inappropriate way to time at work or to making money, because productivity is the thing that I think will give me meaning in my life. So fundamentally, aren't the sources of my bad behavior the things I'm doing to strive to get meaning? The children of Israel, of course, ended up doing the same thing. And so if we use the Bible as their pattern, we can see that part of the whole story, part of the whole narrative is to say that even the people that God came to and spoke to directly ended up doing the very things that he advised them not to do. There's a passage in Jeremiah 7, verse 31. Jeremiah talking about the descendants of Israel. They have built the high places of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire. Something I did not command nor did enter my mind. So even God's own people do the very things he tells them not to do. And I guess my thought is that that's part of the purpose of the whole Old Testament, is to point out for us that the people that God appears to can still find themselves doing the wrong kinds of things, can still find themselves worshiping idols. And so the thing that I was confronted with in my life is to say, well, in what way am I doing the same thing? In what way am I worshiping idols that relate to success or identity kind of thing? The modern thought, of course, is that you don't have to do that. You can simply be your own person. You're not out there beholden to anything. You're just kind of on your own. But the Bible's testimony is that we all worship something. We're not able to not worship. We're built and designed by God to be in an attitude of worship to something. And this is kind of a scary thought, because it turns out if it's not God, it's going to be something else, and the something else is going to be to our detriment. But that's an assertion that the Bible makes, and I think we find it in life. One of the passages that I wanted to read to you was also from Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13. Jeremiah 2:13 says, "My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." Jeremiah is really not concerned about where the people get their drinking water here. He's concerned about what the people see as their source of life. And he doesn't offer the option that, well, they're just living on their own. They just can make up their own rules and be themselves. He says, you either have me as the source of living water, or you have a broken cistern. You have to craft for yourself something to replace me. If God's your creator, if God's the source of life, and you reject him, then in your mind you have to make up something and say, this is going to be my source of life. This is what's going to hold water for me, water being the source of life. But in truth, those are always going to be bad supplies of water. They'll never really hold what you want. But Jeremiah doesn't offer us an option. It's a little bit like when Joshua stands before the people and says, if serving the Lord is troublesome to you, then decide today. You want to serve the gods your fathers served beyond the river back in Egypt, which of course is what some of them had tried to do. Do you want to serve the gods of the Amorites who live in this land, the Canaanites? But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He doesn't offer an option. He doesn't say, well, just be on your own then. Make up your own rules, and everything will be okay. You'll either be following this set of rules, this God, or the true God. So one of the assertions I guess we have to make if we're going to let the Bible be our guide is that we're built for worship, and we're going to be worshiping one thing or another. So we can't not be worshiping, and what we worship is going to then drive our behaviors by what we spend our time thinking about. So I think the next question on my list is what the Bible says to help us interpret this. And by that I really meant what happens in the New Testament? How does the New Testament sort this out? How does the experience of Jesus coming? How does the experience of the gospel being disseminated around the world help us to interpret that? This whole issue with regard to idols. In the New Testament, people were still worshiping idols. Paul goes to Athens and he says, "I saw this temple to an unknown God." And there's a lot of idol worshiping still going on there. So it's not like it's fundamentally different, but we get new teaching in the New Testament because of new understanding that comes with Jesus. And the New Testament talks a lot more about the sinful nature and what in the King James was often called the flesh and the lifestyle of the flesh, let's say. That's referred to a lot more often than this conflict with the idols of the Canaanites. And I always kind of struggle with the sinful nature because when you read the Bible passages that talk about it, like in Galatians and Colossians, those kind of places, it often talks about all these very, very wicked behaviors, sexual immorality and lying and cheating and fighting and things like that. And it's very easy to sometimes say, well, my behaviors aren't on that list of bad things, therefore I must be okay. And if that's the sinful nature, then I must not have that sinful nature. But I think there's more to the sinful nature. Let's turn over to Romans first, Romans 8:5. There's an Old Testament passage someplace, something along the lines of, "As a man thinks, so is he." I didn't look that up. I don't know if I know where that's at, but Proverbs. In Romans 8:5, it says, "Those who live according to the sinful nature have their minds set on what that nature desires, but those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires." And this whole idea of what your mind is set on, what my mind is set on, seems to me to be a better way of describing the flesh and the sinful nature than just looking at the list of bad behaviors. The bad behaviors are derived from what my mind is set on. But it's really, what fundamentally the issue comes down to is, where is my mind set? And I guess what I'm going to propose is, where my mind is set, where my mind goes, tells me what I'm worshiping. Sometimes we think of Sunday morning as worship time. But I'm going to propose that what you think about when your mind is quiet, or what you think about when trouble comes your way, or what crosses your mind when there's a stress, what do you look for relief? Those are the kinds of things that are actually the worship experience, because those are the things that you're inevitably going to be looking to for identity and prosperity. That's what you spend your time thinking about. So when Romans says, what your mind is set on, it seems to me that that's really linking in with this whole idea of what idol do I worship, or what God do I worship. And the bad behaviors that result from that are all a result of looking to something else, looking to different kinds of things to give me the meaning, the prosperity that I want, and not looking to God. The goal that I'm trying to get out of that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I'm choosing to get it in the wrong way. There's a word that the Bible uses often, and it usually gets translated lusts. And again, we can think of that in terms of some sort of bad, sinful activity. But the Greek root means over-desire. It doesn't mean desire for a bad thing necessarily, but it means too much desire for it, seeking it too much, letting it be the thing that gives meaning. And so when we see these kinds of lists that occur in, for example, Galatians 5:19, and the other reference is Colossians 3:5, we need to understand, I think, that it's not so much the behavior that the New Testament writers are trying to get us to change. It's the attitude of mind that leads to those behaviors, which I'm going to say is the worship that leads to those behaviors. In Galatians 5:19, it says, "The acts of the sinful nature are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness and orgies, and the like." And a lot of times I can look at that list and say, I don't do much of that stuff. But I really do the idolatry. The idolatry I really do. It's a little bit more blatant in Colossians 3:5. "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." Okay? So want a lot, I make an idol of. What I'm greedy for, I make an idol of. I spend my time thinking about it. I'm worshiping it. I'm looking to it for my identity and meaning in life. Okay, so if we find ourselves still being afflicted with idolatry, if idolatry is really still a viable thing for us, even in this modern day and age, even as we're sophisticated, what can Christian teaching do for us in that regard, and how can we get over that? The challenging thing I want to get back to, I guess, is the idea that what we're really called on in the Christian life is to restrain our bad behavior. And I think there's a very popular concept, that's what being a Christian is all about. Well, Christians don't do those kinds of things. And if you just restrain your behavior, you'd be a better Christian if you just behave right. But I want to reiterate the idea that our behavior derives from what we spend our time thinking about, what we're worshiping. And it's much easier to access God's power for a righteous life by reordering my worship, spending my time thinking about God, than it is trying to restrain my behavior. And so then the final question on the list there was how is it that we really worship God? And I was astounded by a couple passages that I read. It doesn't come across very well in the NIV translation, but in Romans 1, if you remember Romans 1, there's this whole list of bad things that are happening in the world. And it talks about people being given over to their lusts and things like that. And it sort of is an explanation of how we find ourselves in the place we find ourselves. And in verse 28 it says this, furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind. Some places translate that to acknowledge God. Retain the knowledge of or acknowledge God. So the whole linchpin of the trouble that comes about in the world in Romans 1, creation being given over to suffering, and people giving themselves over to all kinds of terrible behaviors, is the failure to acknowledge God. And this kind of astounded me. The God of the universe created us, sustains the entire universe by his choice, controls everything, is greater than everything. What does he desire? He desires acknowledgement. He says, acknowledge me. In Proverbs 3:5-6, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. That seems like so little. Just acknowledge God. That's not even giving 10%. I mean, that's just saying I agree that God is this person. Trusting in the Lord with all your heart also involves, of course, an attitude of the mind, gratitude and thankfulness. That part of it. But I was really astounded by the subtle word that the Bible uses. Acknowledge God. God's looking for acknowledgement. I can relate to that a little bit as a parent. I guess I care a lot less as a parent whether the kid just makes his bed and does his chores than if he acknowledges what his family's doing for him. If the child acknowledges that, his behaviors follow. If he doesn't acknowledge what his family's doing for him, it doesn't make any difference how I force his behavior to be. So it's very subtle, it seems to me. It sounds to me in a way like God's not asking for a lot, but of course what he's really asking for is for us to spend all of our time thinking about him, giving him all of our gratitude, acknowledging that everything we have comes from him. And acknowledging that he's also going to direct our paths, that there's a future, there's more to come, there's a fulfillment of things. And that's the last verse that I want to read for you. We'll deal with that. One more thing I want to say here, though, is that if we're going to acknowledge God as the provider, and if we're going to spend our time worshiping him, then, of course, we can't acknowledge anything else as the provider. We can't acknowledge anything else as the source of our identity and our meaning. So if we're acknowledging God and spending our time doing that, then we'll necessarily not be worshiping idols. We'll necessarily not be giving our acknowledgement to other things. So when we spend our time ordering our worship and